Let's get started. We are on page 301, and we're discussing the Amidah. We're continuing our discussion of the first blessings of the Amidah, of the Shmona Esrei that we started last week. As we know, there are three blessings that open up the Amidah that are, as the commentaries to the Siddur explain, are words of praise. They are three blessings where we praise Hashem and characterize our relationship with God. And our sages tell us that the reason why the Amidah is structured in that way is because when you stand before a king and you want to be able to present your petition to him, you must first praise the king before you start asking for your personal requests and personal needs. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi tells us that contained within the first three blessings of the Amidah is a philosophical resolution that is being offered. In other words, inherent within any attempt for a human being to approach the divine, there is an inherent tension. And that tension is discussed extensively in all faiths that describe a God, a personal God. And it is described in terms of immanence versus transcendence. I think we've presented these terms sometime in the past, but it may have been a long time since we visited them. Immanence refers to the idea of a personal God, that God is immanent and present and very involved in my life. And transcendence means that God is a very removed God, because by his very definition of being the ultimate deity, he is not capable of inserting himself into a flawed corporeal reality. And so this tension has existed for centuries, ever since man has been able to formulate a description of a God that interacts with humanity. And there have been different ways that different faiths and different thinkers within each respective faith have tried to resolve this inherent contradiction and inherent tension. Do we understand? Am I communicating? You understand the inherent conflict that exists? Please.
No.
Go ahead.
I don't understand what you mean by that he's so transcendent and perfect that he can't be in this world, which is flawed. What do you mean?
Okay, so just as a one example of many, but the problem is that God is removed above time and space. That's the way he is characterized, because anything that is corporeal, that is temporal, is by definition flawed. So part of the way that God is defined as a perfect being is that he is not confined by space. Ein lo demut haguf ve'eino guf, as we say in Yigdal. There's no physical confinement to God, and there's no chronological confinement to God. God is above time as well. So how does a God that is above the physical and above the chronological insert himself into a four-dimensional world that is temporal and is physical?
Why not?
Well, how does that work? If you're removed above time and space, then how do you confine yourself into time and space?
This is God, and he created time and space.
Correct.
So there is a way that he's still here.
So there is a way, right? But the philosophical dilemma is as such. Can God create a rock that is too heavy for him to lift? We've talked about that age-old question, right? Can God create a rock that is too heavy for him to lift?
No.
Can God, in essence, can God dumb himself down to be less than God? So by the definition of Hashem is a perfect being. Once God inserts himself into the physical realm, he becomes, by definition of what the physical realm is, he has inserted himself into a less than perfect reality. Can God make himself confined to the physical? Can God make himself confined to the temporal? This is the dilemma, immanence versus transcendence. And also, if Hashem, by his very characteristics, by his very nature, is removed above time and space, then how can he even be aware? This is part of the dilemma that we started the KUZARI with. Remember, the original conversation that the Khazar king in the story has is, he's trying to figure out what his dream means, that an angel comes to him in a dream. And the first person that he goes to in this story of the Khazar king, is he goes to the Greek philosopher. And the philosopher tells him that there is no way that God knows what your life is about. God is too far removed from the physical world to have any interest or knowledge even of what is happening in this very confined, very tiny, too minuscule for a divine being to confine himself to. So that's the immanence versus the transcendence. Now Judaism contradicts that. Judaism says no. Despite the inherent contradiction, part and parcel of our faith is that God does confine himself to the physical and to the temporal. We can't really understand how it works because we acknowledge it's an inherent contradiction, and yet it's a cornerstone of our faith. Yes, Lynn?
When we talk about the Shekhinah is present, like you were saying how certain times the Shekhinah is present and other times not, are you implying that God is now in our physical time and space, or can he still be in his realm but still be present as the Shekhinah? Like how are we?
Yes, that is all part of the question. We talk about Vayered Hashem Lir'os, that God sometimes is described as descending into our world, like in the Migdal Bavel story, or the story of Sodom and Amorah, that God goes down, or the Shekhinah rests in certain places, like the Medrash tells us, the Shekhinah is always resting on the Kotel HaMa'aravi, even to this day, right? So what does that mean? Some manifestation of God, we don't really understand how God can have different manifestations. There is God as he is defined philosophically, and there are manifestations of God as he allows himself to be known by humanity. And that's part of the mystery. It's part of the mystery, the dilemma. Just as one example, I gave you in this handout, there's an article that was just recently written, but this has been talked about for thousands of years, really, literally. On the face of it, the characteristics of transcendence and immanence appear to be in conflict. A transcendent is one who is beyond perception, independent of the universe, and wholly other when compared to us. There is no point of comparison, no points of commonality. In contrast, an immanent God is one which exists within us, within the universe, etc., and hence very much a part of our existence. There are all sorts of commonalities and points of comparison. How can these two qualities exist simultaneously? And then, that's really the dilemma. And the author of this article points out that the history of this, the idea of a transcendent God, has roots both in Judaism and in Neoplatonic philosophy. By the way, Neoplatonism is something that we've been discussing quite extensively in the KUZARI, simply because that was the philosophy of the Arabic philosophers of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's time. They took a combination of Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism. But the cornerstone of Neoplatonism is try to explain this very thorny issue, which is the relationship between a completely transcendent God and a world that is totally different from that transcendent God. And Neoplatonism presented a theory that our world is comprised of multiple spheres, which we're not going to rehash today. It's a little bit too, I don't want to bog us down in detail. But that there's a series of spheres by which God sort of funnels his presence down to our world. And each sphere that gets closer to our earth is somewhat more distant from God in his true reality, in his true identity, and a little bit more similar to us. And it's a very, very gradual transition. By the way, this is also the basis not only for Maimonidean philosophy, but it's also the basis for Zoharic descriptions of the Eser Sfirot, for the how do you translate Sfirot? Well, we call them spheres because that's what Sefirot means, or realms, or emanations, right? So Neoplatonism forms as the foundation for the 10 emanations that are discussed in the Zohar as well, and in Kabbalah. So this is all part of the attempt to resolve this very difficult contradiction, which is inherent and remains unresolved. There are many things in life that remain unresolved. Toilet seat up, toilet seat down. It's one of those.
That's resolved.
That's in your house. That's resolved. Okay, but
How
there
do
are
they get the Cadbury in the Cadbury bar? That's what you mean.
okay, the caramel. Okay, there are many philosophical dilemmas and mysteries, especially when it comes to the condition of our lives that remain unresolved. And this, when it comes to our relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam, with the Master of the Universe, that's an unresolved conflict or tension. Now, this directly affects my daily prayer in the way that I'm supposed to interface with God. Are you transcendent or are you immanent? How far away from me? How close are you? We talk about our relationship with Hashem as immanent and transcendent in terms of our emotional state when confronting God. What are the two emotional states that we're supposed to have in relationship to Hashem?
Love and fear.
Love and fear. Ahava and Yira. Ahava is immanence. Yira is transcendence. And that's the way that the human being is supposed to relate to Hashem, with the constant tension of Ahava and Yira. Because at face value, they seem to be contradictory. How can I love you if I'm in awe, if I am in fear of you because you are transcendent? How am I supposed to relate to Hashem when I'm davening? Now, for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, this tension remains unresolved, but it also is the unresolved tension that is at the core of the first three blessings of the Amidah. And he says it in a beautiful way. Let's take a look at what he says. During the first Amidah blessing, this is in paragraph 13, during the first Amidah blessing called fathers, called avos, one should impress upon his heart the loftiness of the patriarchs and that the covenant God made with them is everlasting and will never be broken. That is why the blessing states he brings a redeemer to their descendants. So we touched upon this last time, just started this paragraph last time, but the Avos paragraph is really about our recollection that God was a personal God in a very, very intimate way, much more than we're capable of even experiencing in our lives, that Hashem was a very close friend to each one of our avos, and the imahos is for that, by that token, although the way that the Chumash describes it, this kind of intimate relationship was more so with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov than anyone else. And Hashem also made that covenant such that we are capable of being the heirs of that intimate relationship. And that's why we talk about Umevi Goel Livnei V'nehem, that God brings redemption to their descendants, L'ma'an Shemo Bi Ahava. So Ahava, you see that word Ahava appears in the first blessing? That word Ahava appears in the first blessing because we're supposed to feel when we recite that blessing, that sense of immanence, that sense of closeness with Hashem, that we're just the anicle, we're the grandchild of those great avos with whom you shared such a close relationship. Now let's go on to next paragraph. During the second blessing called might, one should contemplate that God has unceasing mastery over this world. This is contrary to what ancient philosophers believe, that this world operates independently under a perceivable natural order. He should then consider that God will resurrect the dead at the desired time, despite the fact that this is the farthest thing from the natural order. He should then think about God's control over all life when saying, Mashiv haruach u'marid hageshem, you cause wind to blow and the rain to fall. And that God deliberately liberates the imprisoned, which is a reference to the Jewish people. Meaning that the idea of we are imprisoned now in Galus, and that God at some point will redeem us. So, the second blessing has a theme that not only talks about God's close relationship with our ancestors, but that God on a constant basis, even to this very day, is involved with bringing unnatural changes to the world. That contrary to what some people believe, that God is a, this is sort of the, he's talking about the God of the philosophers that he talked about at the very beginning of Sefer KUZARI, that God is not aware of you in particular, but that there's a system under which the prime cause, remember that was the name of God for the Greek philosophers, the prime cause, that God is the mover of all, and he is responsible for everything that exists, but it's almost as if it's a God that transmits his influence down through a funnel down to our world, but it's not a conscious effort that God is making, it just happens automatically. So the Greek philosophers talked about a telos. They talked about an intelligence that exists in the otherworldly realms, that through God's knowledge, he sort of causes all things to come into existence. But it's an automatic process. It's not a process that God has to consciously decide, because God is unchanging for the philosophers. And therefore, if God is constantly unchanging, then he therefore does not, at a whim, bring rain here or bring drought there. It all happens through some kind of natural order. It's all just nature, all just chance. And this is directly contradicted by the words of this bracha. Hashem, you are a mashgiach. You have divine providence over everything that happens in the world. That is the second bracha. So it is not a discussion of God's relationship, but rather with human beings, like the first bracha, but it's related in the sense that it talks about God's constant intervention and providence in our world, to the point where even every single blade of grass, according to our sages, is supervised and is told to grow by divine will. Yes?
So if that's the case, then why is this contradiction? Anyone who believes, why would Hashem give us the Torah if he didn't care what we were doing every day?
Exactly. So, but the contradiction is, if God God by his nature is unchanging, for him to insert himself into the world and to decide, today I'm going to bring rain, means that God is subject to change, is subject to a whim. This is part of the contradiction. You're going to see in just a moment. Let's go to the third bracha, and you'll see in just a second. After one affirms the blessings of avos and gevuros, of fathers and might, which emphasize that the concept that God is integrated with the physical world, he then, in the third bracha, exalts, sanctifies, and elevates God to stress the point that no experience of a physical nature could ever be ascribed to God's holiness. This is expressed in the third blessing, Ata kadosh v'shimcha kadosh u'kdoshim b'chol yom yahalalu chasel. In other words, the function of the third bracha of the Amidah is to counter the immanence of the first two blessings. There has to be some balance that if we only emphasize God's closeness and intervention with our lives on a constant basis, we will lose that sense of yira, that sense of reverence for a God who is truly transcendent. And therefore, we need to say, Ata Kadosh. Now, what does the word Kadosh mean? Rashi says that the word Kadosh means muvdal, completely separate, completely transcendent. That's what the word Kadosh means. And therefore, during this blessing, one should internalize in his heart all that the philosophers described about God's holiness and loftiness. And by the way, this is why the Rambam spends so much time emphasizing the true nature of God using philosophical terminology. You look at the first 5 of the 13 affirmations of faith, the Yud Gimel Ikarei Amunah. You know what I'm talking about? The 13 principles of faith, or the 13 affirmations of faith, or the 13 foundational principles of faith. They're in the back. They're at the end of the Shacharit service. The first 5 describe God in philosophical terms of being a completely transcendent God. By the way, there's a whole controversy about, the Shalosha Asar Ikarim, which we're not going to get into now. We've talked about it before. But I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed is His name, creates and guides all creatures, and that He alone made, makes, and will make everything. Well, that's an immanent God, right? But then I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed is His name, is unique, and there is no uniqueness like His in any way, and that He alone is our God, who was, who is, and who always will be. That's a transcendent God, completely removed from anything that is in our frame of reference of existence. Number 3, I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed is His name, is not physical and is not affected by physical phenomena, and that there is no comparison whatsoever to Him. Transcendent God. I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed is His name, is the very first and the very last. Transcendent God. I believe with complete faith that the Creator, blessed is His name, to Him alone is it proper to pray, and it is not proper to pray to any other. That refers to the immanence once again. So much of the Rambam's understanding of Hashem, which he gets even more into in the Moreh Nevuchim, is all about defining God in philosophical terms. And he does so as well in the Mishnah Torah when he talks about God's existence in the very beginning of his Mishnah Torah in Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah. So the Rabbi Yehuda Halevi agrees with that. He says the philosophers do have it right when they talk about the innate essence of what a divine being is. Completely transcendent, completely unique, completely removed from anything physical and from anything temporal. The only thing they got wrong is that God is also immanent. How do we reconcile that? We can't. We won't. So we first emphasize what we know to be based on tradition, that God reveals Himself and inserts Himself into our lives and our physical world. First 2 brachas of the Amidah. But that does not negate, somehow, it does not negate the fact that Atah Kadosh v'Shimcha Kadosh, that you are completely transcendent and fitting within the description of how the philosophers understand God. But one can only do this after he has affirmed God's mastery and sovereignty over the physical universe in the first 2 blessings, Avos and Gevuros, because through them we clarify that we have a ruler and a commander. Without them, doubts might arise in our thoughts based on the philosophers' teachings, or of those who believe that the universe has existed eternally without a creator. Who believed that the universe existed eternally without a creator? Aristotle believed that. And you know why he believed that? He believed that because, based on the philosophical definition of God, God is not subject to change. If God is not subject to change based on His perfect existence, then how could one day God be happy with a universe that is devoid of us, of physical creation, and then one day wake up and say, you know what, I think I'm going to create the world. At one point in God's existence, He decided to change. He changed from no physical existence to an entire universe of physical existence. That is a philosophical challenge to the definition of a perfect deity. Do you understand? Do you see the inherent contradiction? How does a perfect being decide one day, I'm not happy with the current conditions? If you're not happy with something today and you want to change, it means you're in some way deficient. Let's say, there's a leak in the house. You're not happy about it. You feel a sense of privation, a sense of deficiency. I don't like leaking water coming from my roof. I got to fix it. I'm going to go fix the leak. If God was deficient in some way before He created our universe, then that says that God can experience imperfection. And that's a direct contradiction to the definition, the philosophical definition of God, which is absolute perfection. So Aristotle came to the conclusion, based on logic, and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi references Aristotle several times in the KUZARI, and he says, listen, Aristotle was no idiot. It makes sense to say that the universe has eternally existed, because to suggest that God decided just one day out of the blue to create a universe is an inherent challenge to the perfect being that we believe in. And if that's the case, the only way to reconcile that is to say, it's one of those mysteries. Aristotle said, I'm not happy with that. It must be that there was always a universe. Because if there was at one point not a universe, then that means that God was deficient in some way and decided to augment his deficiency by creating. That's not the God that I know, says Aristotle. And therefore, there's an inherent danger when we associate to God as Ata Kadosh v'Shimcha Kadosh. What is the inherent danger? When you subscribe too much to the transcendence of God, you then come to the conclusion, why would God want to have this almighty, perfect being? Why would he want to have anything to do with me? Why would he even care? And that's the reason why you save this bracha for number 3. You've got to affirm that God is the friend of man, especially the Jewish people. He is completely involved with all phenomena that exist in the physical world. That's the second bracha. And then you go into the transcendent God with Ata Kadosh. And by creating that balance, you will not fall into the trap of believing that God is not aware of what's going on. Even today's world, people talk about their belief in a divine being or some kind of higher being, but they don't believe that that higher being has anything to do on a personal basis with their own lives. And that's the fallacy of the philosophical God that we have to dispel by affirming the first 2 brachas. Questions, comments? Yes?
So my question is, why does it take away from God's perfection? Why, like when you describe that he himself changed because he decided to create a world? He could be perfect and just create a universe.
No, you can't be perfect and change.
Right, he's not changing, he's creating other change. He himself isn't changing.
No, but God himself is changing, because he's basically saying, I'm not happy with the status quo. I'm not happy with the current status of my universe, of my whatever is, and I need to change it in some way. Because God is all of existence. God is everything. And if God is everything, there was nothing before God created the world, then what caused him to want to change that status and create physical reality? Something must... A desire. A desire. You only have desire if there's something missing from your life. I don't want a cup of coffee if I don't need a cup of coffee. But if I have a cup of coffee, it means that before I had that coffee, I was missing something. I was missing the caffeine. I was missing something. So that's the inherent contradiction. Okay, one second. Nanette.
Oh, so, well, okay. Basically, like, are you gonna solve that?
Nope.
So,
Nope.
No?
It's considered to be by some to be unsolvable. There are those. If you take a look, he says. Here, let's take a look. Clearly, there is some conflict between these 2 characteristics. The more God's transcendence is emphasized, the less God's immanence can be understood, and vice versa. For this reason, many philosophers have tried to downplay or even deny one attribute or the other. Kierkegaard emphasized God's transcendence, And Protestant theologian Paul Tillich and those who followed him talked about the immanence. They emphasized immanence. The need for both qualities can be seen in the other characteristics normally attributed to God. If God is a person and works within human history, then it would make little sense for us not to be able to perceive and communicate with God. Moreover, if God is infinite, then God must exist everywhere, including within us and within the universe. Such a God must be immanent. On the other hand, if God is absolutely perfect beyond all experience and understanding, then God must also be transcendent. If God is timeless and unchangeable, then God cannot also be immanent within us, beings who are within time. Such a God must be wholly other, transcendent to everything we know. So there are those who try to reconcile the contradiction. I'm sure for God it's not a contradiction. God has no problem with this. There are certain limitations of our thinking that make us view this as a contradiction. But our minds are limited, and we're created in such a way as to view these as being contradictory. But they're not. Okay, Linda.
So how do the people who only believe in God's transcendence, how do they explain the creation of man? Or do they think man was just always there? Like, how do they explain it?
Aristotle was of the belief that everything as it is today has always been, because God is an immutable, unchanging being. And therefore, everything that exists as a product of that immutable, unchanging being must also be immutable and unchanging. Obviously, he did not subscribe to the theory of evolution, right? And by the way, the theory of evolution is also a support to an immanent God. But we won't go there right now. One second. Karen, did you have
No, just an observation that the third bracha is transcendence, correct?
Third bracha is transcendence,
Right, but
yes.
yet we start Atah Kadosh V'Shimcha Kadosh, which is very imminent, which is a God right in front of us. We are speaking directly to Him. So it's just interesting. It's just contradictory to me. Not contradictory, but we needed to get those first two brachot to understand who He was, and then now we can talk to Him as a transcendent God.
Excellent. Isn't that? That's an excellent ha'ara, excellent observation. The first two brachot
I think.
are in the third person.
I thought so. But
First two brachot are in the third person, and we describe the God of immanence in the third person, and then when we talk about the God of transcendence, we speak in the second person. You, Atah Kadosh. So perhaps that's a way of maintaining that balance. Even though I believe in your transcendence, which would normally make me come to the conclusion that you're not even aware of what I'm doing right now, but I can speak directly to you. Beautiful.
No, I think the other two are also in second person, like Atah Gibor, Rachata Hashem, that's not second person.
That's also right. There's also a second person aspect. Atah Gibor l'olam Hashem echem itim atah rav lahoshia. But then we switch to the third person. Mechalkel chayim b'chesed, mechayei meitim. Unless you want to say that also, because it's Lashon Hoveh, maybe that could also be Ata Mechalkel. Micha Mocha. Okay, so perhaps the second bracha also is second person. Okay, good. We'll have to work on this a little bit. See if we can make it fit. Okay. Yes.
Rosh Hashanah, we have to say Amelech HaKadosh.
Yes.
So he's our king. All of a sudden, there's a change.
So the reason for that is we're supposed to ascribe additional transcendence to God on the Yamim Noraim, because we're supposed to increase our Yirah. But so that's what the Meforshim say, that Hamelech represents an even like a more exalted kind of God, but still a God who is supervisory and in control of all of the world. But anyway, yeah, this is. But so I'm not really sure how the change would fit into this description of transcendence. We'd have to work on that, think about that, how that may in some way mitigate our emphasis on transcendence. Maybe it's a little bit more transcendence, maybe it's less, I'm not sure. But in any event, this is why one must preface the blessing of you are holy with those blessings of fathers in might. Okay? Yes?
This whole contradiction isn't really bothering me so much, and I'm trying to figure out why, and I think it's because when you grow up with people who embody both of these things, it doesn't appear to be a contradiction, meaning I grew up very close to my Bubby and Zadie, and they had so much Yiras Shamayim, their whole lives were ruled by that, but if I came home and I said, Bubby, I got an A on my test, she would say, Ritzon Yireav Yaseh. In other words, she was teaching me by saying that, or if I found a parking space, oh, Ritzon Yireav Yaseh. If I do what I'm supposed to do, then Hashem will, give me what I want. So there was always this feeling of, they knew how great Hashem was, and when it came to davening, they were in such awe of Hashem. But still, they felt like, oh, if something good happens, Ritzon Yireav Yaseh.
Okay, let me touch on it, then we're going to stop. Let me touch on that for just a second. I found a parking space. The immanent God that answers all prayers helped me find the parking space. Which, of course, the old joke. Guys circling the blocks, say, God, please give me a parking space. I'll give you everything. And all of a sudden, there's an empty parking space in the middle of Manhattan. He says, God, never mind, I found one. But anyway, that's the old joke. But how don't you appreciate, on one level, how believing that God helped you find that parking space is trivializing God? You don't see that at all.
No, just
How many of you are bothered on some level by the fact that if you believe in a transcendent God who's running the entire universe and is making a pathway for the messianic age and has very, very lofty goals and objectives, that same God is going to say, Sachachevsky, I know you're looking for a parking spot. We're going to let you find one now.
Because he's God. He can do everything at one time.
Okay.
It brings the feeling of love. It intensifies. God helped me to
Exactly.
power.
Yes. Okay.
It's easier to connect with smaller things also.
It's
And with
easier
the
to connect. I understand.
bigger
But we have to also remember that we have to create a balance. If we're going to look at God as the guy with the, remember that guy in the Flintstones, kazoo? Fred Flintstone would snap his fingers and all of a sudden this alien would come or I Dream of Jeannie, she'd just, go blink her eyes and then all of a sudden everything would happen. If we're going to make God such a personal God, that he's the guy with the magic wand who just is at our beck and call, so we are in some way lowering God's stature. And we have to remember that there's nothing, that there's virtue in that. There's virtue in making God so immanent. We also have to make him transcendent at the same time. We have to create the balance. Okay, can we continue this conversation next time?